maritime history of Cape Cod is a proud legacy. The story of her wooden ships and men of iron is older than the Republic itself. American whalers came first from Cape Cod and went to sea into the 20th century. But there is another side to the story. During the 19th century, the great number of shipwrecks on these shores put them among the most feared on the Atlantic coast. These disasters fostered a respected tradition dedicated to the rescue of shipwreck victims. Thousands of people owe their lives to these brave Cape Codders. They too were of the sea. European whalers came to North America before there were settlements in New England. Europe had many uses for whale oil and baleen, also called whalebone. They often went to Greenland and hunted among the icebergs. Soon after the Pilgrims arrived, the whales off Cape Cod began to play an important part in the colonists' economy. Early Cape Cod settlers did their whaling near the land and their butchering on the shore, a technique learned from the native Nauset Indians. There was a great demand for whale products and there was much money to be made, but whaling was as dangerous as it was lucrative.
And the whale gets strike, and the line run down, and the whale makes a plunder with its tail, and the boat capsized, and I lost my darling man. No more Greenland for you.
The major Cape Cod whaling and fishing ports were Falmouth, Truro, Wellfleet, and Provincetown. They were built in the heyday of wooden ships and canvas sail. Like other Cape folk, the people of Provincetown depended on what they could harvest from the sea. Sometimes a finback might wash ashore and die. Pilot whales were driven ashore by men in small boats. They would take their whales however they could get them. Products from Provincetown whaling supported an active local industry until the early 1920s. The Viola was the last American sailing ship to be built as a whaler. She was a brigantine owned and skippered by John Cook of Provincetown. She was built in 1910, and this film is a record of her third voyage. When a whale was sighted, the boats were lowered, the equipment made ready, and the chase was on. A line is made fast to the whale, and the crew hauls it alongside to begin cutting in. One of the men passes a final line around the whale, awash in shark-infested water. And then the first blubber, the blanket piece, is hoisted aboard. The precious case oil is bailed out of the whale's head. The ivory teeth are removed from the jaw. The tryworks are fired up. The blubber is sliced up on the deck with long-handled cutting spades. It's boiled for its yield of oil. What's left is ladled out and used for fuel. It was 1916. The Viola put to sea for another whaling expedition the following year, and neither she nor her crew was ever seen again.
And the boat capsized, and I lost my darling man. No more Greenland for you.
For the North Atlantic is a harsh and unforgiving mistress, and she can turn cruel without warning. More than 3,000 ships have been wrecked on the Cape, thousands of lives lost. January 9th, 1890, the Matilda Buck. November 26th, 1898, the Albert L. Butler. November 30th, 1892, the Kate Harding. A 712-ton British bark flung ashore at Truro in a gale like a toy. Her bottom was ripped out. She could only be stripped for salvage. December 5th, 1893, the Jason. 20 lives lost, 1 survivor. Shipwrecks on the Cape were so common that in 1786, the Massachusetts Humane Society tried to aid the victims. At first, it built shelters, and later it provided rescue boats for shore crews. But there were still so many wrecks and deaths that in 1871, Congress created the United States Life-Saving Service. On Cape Cod, stations were built about every 5 miles along the outer beach, and were manned by trained crews during the long stormy season from August through May. The men came from local families. Son often followed father into the service. The stations were built close to the shore, and the men lived there. For the 10 months between summers, there were always patrols on the beach, looking for ships in distress. In 1915, the Life-Saving Service and the Revenue Cutter Service merged to form the United States Coast Guard. A retired Coast Guardsman, Louis Silva of Provincetown, remembers what it was like.
The officer in charge would give the different orders. You'd haul the boat down towards the surf. And they know just what they had to do with these certain orders. And just as soon as that time was right to launch the boat, they'd say, go. And when they gave the order, go, why the rest of the men would push the boat in the water and jump in and man the oars. To go out over those Chatham bars, it was pretty tricky. There'd be about 3 or 4 rows of breakers, and the bars kept changing all the time, so it was different every time you went out through there. You don't think about yourself. You don't think about the danger. You think about what you've got to do next.
Every week, while the stations were manned, there were drills in the use of both surfboat and breeches buoy, or beach apparatus. A line was shot from shore to the ship in distress. It was drawn taut and supported the rescue seat, but it was used only as a last resort. The surfboat was the preferred means of rescue. These weekly drills were a major local attraction, but the men were in earnest. They knew the sea could turn against them at any time, and that it would be as dangerous for them as for those on the wrecks. Winter was the bitterest season, as well as the busiest. In the 1880s, there was an average of 3 wrecks a month on the Cape. All hands were saved on February 7th, 1922, when the English freighter Thistlemore went aground at Peaked Hill Bars. Life expectancy in the frigid winter water would have been only a few minutes. She was one of the very few ships to be wrecked after the Cape Cod Canal was built. It was opened in 1914, and for the first time there was a truly safe passage for New England coastal shipping. But it also meant the end of an era. Many of the Coast Guard shore stations were claimed by the sea. Others were shut down. The last of the shore patrols went out in the early 1950s. But the memories of the old days run deep on the Cape. The men of the shore stations had worked as a unit, bonded by training and fellowship. The legacy of that proud tradition is the modern Coast Guard. Cutters and helicopters have replaced men in open boats. Radar and radio have replaced flares and signal lanterns. Men on vessels in distress are rescued with winch-powered rescue baskets instead of the breeches buoy. Sea rescue is now most often done from the air. Most of the old shore stations are gone now. The surf boats and breeches buoy, only memories from a time when men of iron went down to the sea in wooden ships.